Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 40th episode of 2023. But before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Fiber Breakfast, and our gold sponsor, Network Connects. You know, it was a busy time in Washington over the weekend. After the Senate passed a 45-day stopgap funding bill on Saturday night, they went ahead and voted to reconfirm both Commissioner Stark and Commissioner Carr for another term at the FCC, among the other confirmations. You know, the FCC are 5-year terms. So the good news is we now have a full slate of 5 FCC commissioners, and they're all confirmed. But the bad news is, with 3 Democratic commissioners in place, the FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel has reopened Pandora's box, announcing the FCC will consider initiating an open internet rulemaking at its meeting on October 19th. This proposal would reclassify broadband as a Title II service, subjecting it to a variety of common carrier regulations, including ex post oversight of rates. FCC is definitely going to be reviewing Chairman Rosenwelser's, I can't even say that today. It's been a 30-hour flight, so sorry about that. Proposal to closely, and we'll be reviewing that proposal closely and working with all the FCC commissioners to ensure the FCC first does no harm. You know, our next and final regional Fiber Connect workshop for 2023 will be in Minneapolis on October 24th. The registration for this event has been the strongest of all our regional events so far this year, so you're not going to want to miss that. So please register today, because it definitely is going to sell out. Well, I said I just got back from South Africa last night. I will be on a 5 a.m. flight to Mexico on Monday morning for our Latin America Fiber Connect event in Mexico City. This is our second of 2 Latin America Fiber Connect events, with the first being in Santiago, Chile, back in June. That was a great event, and we're expecting about 700 to 800 delegates, and it should be another fantastic Latin America fiber event. So that's going to be, I'm looking forward to that. But that brings us today's Fiber for Breakfast session with Brian Dar with Ookla, who's going to discuss crowdsource data and BEAD state challenge process. But before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who will walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco, and our gold sponsor, Network Connects. Now, if everyone would keep in mind that you're in listen mode only, to ask a question, you can just type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. Please take a minute to do that. We truly appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Well, thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. You know, last week on Fiber Breakfast, we had the pleasure of hearing from our good friend Quinn Jordan of the Mississippi Broadband Association, who discussed Mississippi Broadband Association's Connect and Literacy Fund. You know, nearly 19% of Mississippians live in poverty, and almost 41%, that's 41%, don't have access to PCs or tablets. So making the digital, you know, closing the digital divide is an especially significant challenge in Mississippi. And Quinn and the Mississippi Broadband Association have launched a Connect and Literacy Fund to help raise the quality of life for the residents of everyone in the state. You know, this is a great initiative, and I hope to see more efforts like this across the country. Now today, for Fiber Breakfast, our guest is Brian Dar with Ookla, who's going to discuss crowdsource data and the BEAD state challenge process. Brian Dar is the Vice President of Government Affairs at Ookla, spearheading the company's program for federal, state, and local government. He also leads Ookla's advocacy efforts with lawmakers and policy organizations, promoting the value of crowdsourced intelligence to help with better data-driven decisioning. Brian has spent most of his professional life in the wireless industry, beginning his career as a cellular as a sales rep for Cellular One of Memphis in 1985. After discovering his customers were having difficulty traveling with their phones, he founded Mosaic in 1988, originally branded American Roamer, and began developing consumer roaming guides. Soon, Mosaic was researching and designing mobile operators' coverage maps, enabling them to market the reach of their mobile networks. In June 2018, Mosaic was acquired by Ookla. Brian has served on many industry committees during his career, and he currently serves on CTIA's Smart City Steering Committee and the Wireless History Foundation's Board of Directors. So welcome, Brian. And for audience, please type in your questions as go, and we'll work them in the Q&A at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Gary. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your members this morning. As you were reading my bio there, I'm realizing just how dated I am within this industry, hearing someone else read it out loud. But I'm very much appreciative of the opportunity to talk to everybody today about what's going on the BEAD state challenge process. You mentioned Mississippi. They're one of many states that we're working with right now that are utilizing our data to better understand what people are actually experiencing out there and what areas that they might need to target that potentially might not agree with the FCC's national map. Trish, if you wouldn't mind jumping to the next slide here. I'm going to show you a little bit of this is a slide I actually created for the West Virginia Broadband Conference in Charleston earlier this year. This is just straight out of our portal, our Speed Test Intelligence portal, and it's pretty astonishing as they have already been for a number of years in West Virginia, providing awards for ISPs to go build out improved networks, particularly fiber networks, throughout the state. You can see here just in 2 years using ARPA funds and previous state funds and other federal programs, just a few of the areas that have been improved. In 2 years, we've seen just significant jumps in throughput, improvements in latency, and so forth. If we could go to the next slide, please, Trish. And this is just a view, across the state of looking at half years from the first half of 2023 going back to the first half of 2021. The kinds of jumps that we've seen in download speeds and upload speeds, and most across many of the operators there, not all. And it does clearly show you, who has been making improvements in the state. And Frontier here has had the best improvement on the latency, as we want to see all of those trending downward on the latency side. The next slide is going to show you a little bit about what we're here to talk about today, which is the BEAD model challenge process and how states are contending with this. The NTIA has put together this program, and there's modules in there that that are already pre-approved and can be selected. Basically, they can just say, if it's DSL, we're going to ignore it. They also have the ability to modify the maps based upon speed tests. And the next piece here, it points out, though, that states also have the ability to not use just the modules that are provided, but they also have the ability to develop their own challenge process. And some of them are doing that. And West Virginia, on the next piece here, is actually going to has actually turned in their initial proposal. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2. We're not going to go into all the details of that right now, but basically, how are you going to walk through your state challenge process and give the eligible entities there the opportunity to agree or disagree with the conclusions that the state has reached on eligibility, which is certainly directed by the FCC map, but they have the ability to go make changes to that in areas where they disagree with it. The next slide is again from West Virginia. This was actually directly out of their mapping system that shows the Ookla speed tests plotted on the map and aggregated by the hexagons. The BSLs are in the blue dots, and they're looking both at the hexagons and at the census blocks. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute and how different they are. But looking at both of these, as the FCC is using hexagons to visualize the national broadband map, yet all that's important demographic data, number of households, economic factors, ethnic backgrounds, are all going to be collected at this census block level. So extraordinarily important to be able to correlate all of this information. And the next slide, is really as we're working with states, we're asking, what is in your toolbox? The one thing that NTIA has made it very clear that they're going to be flexible with how states want to approach these issues. But where they are not going to be flexible, clearly, is that once they have their plan in place, they've gone through that public notification process. Once they've turned it in and it's finalized, you can't add any more tools to your toolbox. And so, Trish, if you would, push the button there. What Ookla brings to the table is the ability to measure and monitor your broadband connectivity and also balance this funding distribution to meet the various digital equity goals that these different states have. So the next piece of this slide then is really just shows what Crowdsource actually does provide. A lot of states are walking through, are setting up their own speed test on their websites, and they're doing so sometimes with our platform, sometimes with a different platform, but they're collecting this information along with surveys. So they want to match a speed test with a survey, and that actually fits that one of those pre-approved modules. But Crowdsource is going to provide just these ongoing fresh data points. It is a third-party validation. And the other thing is that it's extraordinarily difficult to get the public really engaged. And so as important as it is to collect these speed tests along with a survey, Crowdsource data is going to provide, depending upon the state and level of engagement of the public, there somewhere around 100 times as many data points as typically collected in one of these statewide or even local attempts to pull this data in. The next slide is we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to make this easier for everybody. We have this enormous amount of data, and one of the things that we've been hearing from people, frankly, for the last several years, but particularly since we expanded out of the immediate telecom space, a lot of these people involved in this aren't very familiar with telecom. Most telecom companies that have gotten our data in the past have known exactly what to do with it, but it also can be a heavy lift even for them, because we've got millions and millions of points, and each of those points has got dozens of fields associated with it. And so we launched our broadband performance data set well over a year ago that simplifies our data, and it was well received by NTIA and many of our telecom clients, and certainly by our state clients, but it was still a pretty heavy lift. And the bigger the state, the more data there is that's got to be consumed. We're getting ready to roll this out as ready to use Esri layers. People who have an Esri platform are going to be able to just license our data and roll it directly in, and it'll all be pre-formed. So the next slide is actually going to show you how we're a view of these layers, one of these layers nationally. If we could advance to the next one, thank you. So these are the speed tests that have been captured across the entire country for a 1-year period and then aggregated by census blocks. We're looking at the median download speed. And commonly in the past, people have looked at those average speeds and those median speeds. But we have approached this differently when it comes to this particular use case. The question is not so much what people are experiencing, but what can actually be delivered to a serviceable location. And so we're actually looking at the fastest tests. And so we're going to zoom in on this area in Kentucky that's shown in the box on the map. And so the next slide is actually going to show both a hexagon view over here on the left by hex 8, and then the census block view on the right. So as you aggregate up to these census blocks, you're going to see the map really start to fill in. There's a lot of space out there where there are no people. And not everybody, of course, takes a speed test as much as we might want them to, and as much as the state may want them to take a test. But this indicates pretty clearly as we're looking at the 80th percentile. So we're really looking at just the best tests, what's actually going on out there. And you can start to see even some of these areas in Eastern Kentucky, very mountainous, typically rather poor economically, the kind of improvements that are being made. But you can also see the patches here in yellow and particularly in red, where we've got a lot of work yet to do, where the industry and the state, as they have these funds become available and start funding these projects, are going to see that. But there are projects already being funded. Let's keep that in mind. You've had ARPA funds and you've had other programs in the past. And the next slide is actually, I think, going to be particularly interesting to the folks in the fiber community, because what we're looking at here is a snapshot on the left. I've just gotten a snapshot out of the FCC's National Broadband Map, and I zoomed in and chose a location and the reading that it provided back for just a random location in West Liberty, Kentucky, and then another one in Sawyersville, Kentucky. You're looking at median latency, and the dark green tells you that folks in this area are experiencing median latency of less than 5 milliseconds, as opposed to the areas around that where you see typical cable providers, DSL providers, or satellite providers, whatever the case may be, non-fiber providers. You're not seeing that kind of extraordinary improvement in latency. So these were just a couple of examples that I pulled out of here. I didn't have room to put everything on the slide, and we didn't have that much time today, but you could go through and pick through these areas, and you can see where these carriers have rolled out fiber to their customers. Just a couple more slides that I want to show here, and we're going to advance through these. This is an area in Colorado, and a couple of these slides you may have seen if you've seen my presentations on others, but I'm building up to a final slide to make a point here. So Trish, if you'll click on that, we're going to zoom in here down to Durango, and between Durango and Durango West. These are speed tests that have been captured out in an area between two dense areas where fiber is affordable to deploy, but we've got speed tests showing truly poor service in an area between these two denser, more densely populated areas. The next slide then is going to overlay, we're going to see the BSLs that are in the FCC map. All the green dots indicate where there is a broadband serviceable location. The next slide, we're now going to overlay where the FCC claims there is broadband, or someone, I should say, someone has claimed they're offering broadband and reported that to the FCC, which is really, of course, what that map represents. The shading just simply represents how many providers there are in the area, but if there's a hexagon there, at least one of them is claiming to offer broadband. The next slide then is going to overlay the speed tests that we see, and then we actually have a cluster view on the next slide that indicates how many speed tests are actually being captured in that area. Clearly, this area is not being served, but someone's claiming to provide broadband service here. Yet, there's only a handful of tests that are somewhere between 25 and 100 down, and the vast majority of tests are clearly below 25 megabits per second down. As we now roll out, so who's making these claims? I think we're missing one slide there, Trish. Did we miss one? It's all right. I can just kind of talk through it here. The next slide was actually wireless service providers rolled over the area, and we've got what it indicated was the wireless providers also don't have very strong signal strength across this same area. So that not only do we have poor terrestrial connectivity here through DSL services, but even the mobile providers are struggling to provide service within those areas. Yet we have actually multiple players claiming to provide better than 25.3 within that area. So that's the end of the slides, Gary.
Well, No, super interesting. So, Trish, cruise to slide, I guess it's about 7 on the speed test slides. Can you zip it up to, anyways, it should say slide 7, if you can get there. But anyway, I mean, I'm kind of horrified. You know, just looking at West Virginia, go up to said speed test. There you go. Next one. One more. No, other way. One more, other way. Yeah. We'll get there. Well, there we go. When I looked at the slide, I was like horrified because, you know, while yeah, it looks great that looks like Infinity had some decent download speed. I mean, the upload speed is horrific. I mean, 20 meg, or I mean, that's unbelievable. And so that's going to meet the statute. And then when you look at the latency, I mean, if you look at overall nationally during the pandemic, an average network was getting about 20 milliseconds of latency. And 20 milliseconds isn't even on the chart for this in West Virginia. I mean, it's crazy,
not.
Right?
Now let's keep in mind that, you know, these are median numbers. And so you've got large parts of the state that have not been upgraded to more modern networks. And they're going to have a drag on these numbers. And it's one of the reasons why we've taken the approach of looking at the best tests and looking at a very granular area to better understand what ISPs are actually capable of delivering. You do have people that take tests under a variety of different circumstances, right? And that's one of the criticisms of crowdsourcing that we've worked hard to just meet head on here. You do have people that'll take tests when they're having a bad experience on the internet. Well, sometimes it is the ISP that's having temporary congestion issues, temporary equipment problems. But sometimes it's not the ISP at all. Sometimes they get a brilliant speed test and they discover that it's actually Netflix that's down, AWS having a big outage, or some other website that's having a problem. And they run a speed test as a diagnostic tool. And very often it actually tells them that their ISP is doing fine, that there's no problem there. But you're going to have people that take tests. A lot of these tests are captured on Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi routers can generally capture, you know, excellent speeds needed to meet these thresholds that are built into the IIJA and the broadband rules of 25.3 and 120. Any modern Wi-Fi router can capture that, but many modern Wi-Fi routers, like here in my own house, I get 800 megabits down on my router pretty typically, but on my Wi-Fi system, it taps out close to 300. So we've got to take that into consideration as we look at these tests. And what we're focused on here with this particular use case that we're driving is, can an area deliver speeds above these specific thresholds that make them eligible? Measuring for gig speed, and we can, by the way, our server network can measure up to 10 gigs, but you do have to have the right kind of solid connection in order to be able to capture that. But the tests that we see coming back from mobile devices and so forth are commonly on Wi-Fi routers. We have a way to actually filter those to make sure that it's a good Wi-Fi connection, because that can be a factor as well. But yes, what you're seeing here statewide in West Virginia is improving, but a long way from where we need to be.
So just to make sure I heard what you said. So when you're doing an Ookla speed test, you're measuring from where to where?
We're measuring from the device to a speed test router and back. And so that can take place.
Your device, so your computer, your phone. And so, because that's, you know, when I have AT&T fiber here, so I have a gigabit symmetric, and I was getting like 5 meg upstream, and I'm like, what is going on? So I did a speed test, and, you know, it told me I'm getting, you know, like 100 by 5. And then I went to AT&T, and they were able to measure to my ONT, and I was getting, you know, 900 and some odd gigs meg symmetric. So I had to go and update my router, and then I put in Wi-Fi 6 mesh network, and and I was able to get that fixed up. But if someone doesn't have a good in-home access points and the latest mesh network, they're going to have a hard time being able to really determine what their speed is, right?
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and this works both ways. This can be both on the consumer as the problem, or it could be that providers have not upgraded the equipment that they're leasing or renting to their end user, and putting fiber to the home is only part of the solution. You do have to have better connectivity inside the home as well, and our capabilities here at Speed Test can provide. Our data actually captures what type of device, like what type of Wi-Fi router, model number, and even operating system software that we see coming back from the device. So there's a lot of data that can be read into what we're capturing to understand where the problem is in many cases, not always, but in many cases.
Well, all right, so let's get into this. NTIA, so the state broadband offices have to December 27th to turn in their proposals to NTIA. So how's this going so far?
It very much depends upon the state. There are some states like West Virginia, South Carolina, Colorado that have had a broadband office for a long, long time, and they're staffed up. They've got people that have got a lot of experience. Other offices didn't get funding from their states until fairly recently, and some of them are still getting by on just literally a staff of 2 or 3. So many of those folks, of course, have gone to outside consultants to help them get up and running. And I think it's going to be quite a variety of plans that we see turned in and how well these are ultimately executed. But the more data that they have, the better decisions I think they can make. That certainly, and that includes not just our data, but any data that you can get from any other source, and understanding how that data should be used and not used. We don't want our data misused, and it's part of our educational process as we've worked with these states to make sure that they understand how our data should be looked at and which tests should be filtered out, frankly, because it's not a fair representation of what the ISP can provide.
Hey, Trish, go to slide 13 that says 80th percentile download speeds in Eastern Kentucky. If you can do that. So the slide 13. You can zip to that one. But anyway, so that one, it just, to me, highlights how bad the CAF, the issues of the CAF program, the FCC Connect America and other things where they're using, keep going to, it should be slide 13, it should be the Eastern Kentucky. You'll see 2 blocks with a bunch of dots in it. There it goes. Yeah, so this one you look at, so the census block, right, when you have a home served in a census block, it counts the whole census block. And so you get something that looks like on the right where everything looks, it's all great because you serve one home in a census block. And these census blocks can be gigantic, especially when you get to the Midwest. And then when you go to hex, not looking so great. So what is the big difference between like CostQuest and FCC's new data mapping versus using the speed test, using the Ookla data?
They're both important. Of course, CostQuest initially was their first task was collecting all of the broadband serviceable locations and getting them mapped. But certainly, as the providers are reporting their information to the FCC, then that's getting updated every 6 months as well. But this is self-reported data, and some of these folks are claiming areas where the technology itself might be somewhat problematic in areas where you've got difficult topography or vegetation, frankly, in the case of some of the wireless services that are out there. And look, I grew up in the wireless industry. I'm a big fan of wireless and mobile connectivity. Fiber is critical to expanding mobile connectivity as well. The old saying, there is no wireless without wires, is certainly true here. Nobody's going to put a 5G cell site where they don't have good access to fiber connectivity for that site. So all of this build out for fixed networks can also help the mobile networks too. And it's one of the things that we're trying to drive home with states. At the same time, you do have this issue of needing as granular a data as possible, and where you have providers that are claiming levels of technology that are either too old, perhaps in the case of DSL, or just don't have the capacity. Even if you could theoretically meet certain speed points, can you actually serve everybody in the area that you have claimed, right? That's another one of the issues here that has to be contended with. And the states have quite a bit of leeway in terms of what technologies ultimately they want to be able to accept based upon the number of people that it has to serve there. And looking at all of these demographics and looking at the experiences that people are having as these networks are getting rolled out, and all of our data does actually capture the ISP as well. It's not just a down, up latency metrics. We do know who the ISP is, and so they can see that within the data. And they know on these slower speeds that they can go back and hold those ISPs, or at least question them and say, why aren't people experiencing the kind of speeds that you are advertising in these areas?
So, Brian, one of our audience question is, and hopefully you can answer this, what's the difference in crowdsourcing for the BEAD program, NTIA, versus crowdsourcing for an enhanced ACAM offers with the FCC? Can that work?
Well, in many ways, it's simply a matter of what the specific rules are. The crowdsourcing approach is we have really, according to all of these plans, we really have tried to be as consistent as possible as how our data should be looked at within that particular use case. And I think it is extraordinarily important that people be looking at the best tests that are coming back from an area, not looking at those average or medium speeds. It's very important to look at those when you're trying to understand how people are experiencing networks in one area versus another area. But you really do have to be looking at the highest level of tests to understand what ISPs are capable of delivering to a given area. And in that respect, I don't think it's significantly different.
Well, Brian, I could sit here and listen to you all day because I love that your data and I love everything that you guys are doing at Ookla. And I really appreciate how closely you're working with NTIA. I can't tell you how happy I am with what NTIA has been doing on this program. And not that they always do what I want to do, but they do listen and they are very approachable. And so I'm glad that they're able to have great partners like you to help move this process forward. And thanks for your work with the states.
Our data has been very, very involved in their in-band map and so forth. We've worked with them for many years now. They're a good partner.
Fantastic. Well, you're one of my favorite guests. I'm a big data nerd and love, listening to your data, and because you always have very relevant things to say. But thanks everyone for joining us today. Look forward to getting back together next Wednesday in 5 for Breakfast with our good friend and strategic partner, Mike Render of RVA Research. And he's going to be able to discuss his latest research that reveals fiber is preferred by nearly 2/3 of all internet users. You're not going to want to miss that. Also, hopefully we'll see you guys in Mexico or in Minneapolis here soon. So thanks everyone. We'll see you guys again next Wednesday.